Welcome to the Invero Show, where the team from Invero brings together thought leaders from our customers and partners to share our combined knowledge of the Microsoft Cloud ecosystem with the world in hopes of helping you along your cloud journey. And now for today's episode.
I'm Sean Ambrose, part of the leadership team here at Invero. I've been here coming up on a year and a half, and joined with me are a couple of my Invero colleagues. Ian Herron is here. Ian is our client executive that covers, he's based in Calgary and covers Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. Ian and I were just reminiscing how we've been colleagues for coming up on 20 years here together through a few different roles. And then the main event of thought leadership here is our colleague Stephanie. Stephanie leads our licensing practice, which is both the licensing operations part and as well as the client interfacing value component to that. So let's jump right in here because we've got a jam-packed value agenda here for you. So in terms of what we're going to cover off, just kind of zip through this. I'm going to cover off the first little bit, and then I'm going to pass it over to Steph, who's going to bring a lot more value and detail to this. So I'm going to cover off just really quickly why is this worth learning about? Like, why is it worth spending 30, 40 minutes of your day to have this conversation? I'm going to very briefly cover who is Invero. Many of you, we do all sorts of business together, so it's you're familiar, but nonetheless, we have some people here that are less familiar with us. So I'll just spend a minute and cover that off and really link it to the topic is really the point I want to make. And then I'm going to pass it over to Steph, who's going to go into detail of what is this thing called AHUB? How can I utilize it? And AHUB is Azure Hybrid Use Benefits. Tell me about savings plans and reserve instances, often called RIs. Tell me about these. Tell me about some of the changes that are coming up. And then ultimately, what are some ways that we as Invero think we can help you through this journey? So without further ado, I'm going to just spend a minute here on why is this worth learning about. And Steph and I were both looking at this slide recently, realizing that this is a common challenge, right? Like this is a widespread challenge is really what I'm trying to say. Is, as I was saying before I interrupted myself here on the recording component, of as there's been this explosive growth around cloud usage, hyperscale cloud usage of any of the major cloud providers, there's this question that's on the minds of those that operate these environments of how do I manage the spend? You've got different people doing different things in the environment, and for the most part, it's all very well intended, but all of a sudden things can just spiral out of control, and all of a sudden your bill climbs and you don't know why, and just how do you stay on top of it? And this third-party study from Flexera, it just reinforces that, right? That whether you're a large enterprise or a medium-sized business, the number one challenge that seems to be on the IT department's mind is manage cloud spend. You can see here there's lots of other priorities that are critical as well, but that managed cloud spend is just crucial to figure out. So we're grateful for all of you investing some time here. This is why, and I hope that once I pass it over to Steph, you're going to get that detailed value that'll help you feel like you're on top and you're proactive of that. What is the biggest challenge out there in the market? So I'll just spend a minute here on Invero, and as I say, many of you are quite familiar with this, so I'll try and be succinct, but to connect the dots. So real quick, for those that are less familiar, Invero started the business in 2016. We're based in Vancouver. We're a Canadian organization, although we do serve clients around the world, but our hub is actually right here in Greater Vancouver. Invero started, for many of you to remember back, that's really when Microsoft set up shop with Azure facilities in Canada, Canada Central and Canada East. And Craig Slack, who's our founder and CTO of Invero, had a deep background in cloud, a deep background in service delivery, and had operated business before, and said, you know what, I think there's a big market and a big need here for clients to have help and support in adopting Azure and other Microsoft technologies. Over the years, the business has grown and expanded to other disciplines and capabilities to serve our clients. So you can see here visually, we've grown up in the Azure core space on the left, which is really our beginnings were in infrastructure. That shifted into helping clients modernize their application environment, and then that really shifted into our data analytics practice, which then expanded into modern work. And then you can see right there in the middle, Microsoft licensing, and this is really where Steph fits in, is to help on that advisory level. I'll just quickly draw your eyes to the top of this screen, and then I'm going to move on. Yes, sometimes we get asked that question of like, hey, there's lots of organizations that do versions of what you do. What makes your organization special or unique? And it really comes down to these three things of number one, you can see there, this is what we do. Like we don't do other things. We're not a value added reseller that sells laptops or network switches. And I don't mean that in a disparaging way. I just mean more, this is what we do. We are totally focused on the Microsoft cloud portfolio. Number two is really, really important. We've built up this capability around expert level Microsoft license advisory. And Steph and I have had the good fortune of working together in the past as well. And something that we realized through the journey of serving clients was that it's every bit as important when we serve a client and help them on their cloud journey. It's every bit as important to think about the architectural design value to stand up that environment as it is to think about the licensing architecture design. Um, it's like a couple legs of the stool, and they're both important. And if you miss one, you're missing part. You could have a very well architected Azure environment, but the licensing structure itself is suboptimal, and therefore your architecture is great, but you're just overspending. Or you could be the other way, and your licensing structure is optimal, but your architecture is suboptimal. You need both to operate at that optimal state of efficiency. Um, and then ultimately, the third thing that we're really proud of is really who we are. That we view how we engage with you as clients as an accountability-based partnership, and that we do what we say. In the world of IT service delivery, we hope we work very hard to make sure everything goes right, but sometimes it doesn't, and when it doesn't, we're going to make it right. That's just who Invero is. So that's my quick kind of 2 minute on Invero. I'll just double click here before I pass it over to Steph. This slide just goes a little deeper into that practice function of Azure core from an infra and an application level. And really what I want to draw your eyes to is when we think about Azure optimization, as I touched on a moment ago, I really think of it in two buckets of the well architected framework component, your architecture design of how you or we have built Azure together, and then your licensing optimization. And they happen independently of one another, but they must come together for that maximum optimization. And so if you see here in terms of the types of things that we offer and how we help our clients, you see here there's this well architected review, and then right below it is cost optimization. This is what I'm trying to bring forward in thought is well architected review is the architecture of how you've built your Azure environment. Are you leveraging infrastructure as code? Are you leveraging containers, Kubernetes, those kind of things? That's not what we're talking about, although it likely will be a future webinar topic. What we're going to talk about today is the topic right below, which is the cost optimization. So this is not necessarily a conversation about the architectural design, but more so around whatever your design is, without making any changes to it. How do we help you make sure that the licensing structure of how you're operating Azure is as optimal as possible? So with that, Steph, I'm going to pass it over to you, and I'll be here to advance the slides whenever you're ready.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. All right. So what I'm going to talk about is how to save money on your existing Azure environment without making too many changes, and definitely no infrastructure changes. So when we're talking about these Microsoft programs, they're mainly geared towards Azure VMs, and there's two components of the cost to your Azure VMs. There's the compute and then the licensing side of things. So the Azure Hybrid Use Benefit is to address the cost savings associated with the licensing side of things. And what it is was a program introduced to remove a barrier of entry to getting workloads into the cloud for existing Microsoft customers that had already made a pretty sizable investment in on-prem licensing. So Microsoft is allowing customers that have licenses with active software assurance to bring them into Azure with you to utilize. So that's going to help reduce and eliminate, in most cases, those licensing costs for Azure for your virtual machines. So there are definitely some guidelines and rules to this program. Of course there is. So the two workloads that it's going to work for, the two license types, is Windows Server and SQL Server. Now, for Windows Server Data Center, you can actually use them both on-prem and in Azure at the same time. For Windows Server Standard or SQL Standard or SQL Enterprise cores, it's either or. So you'd pick if you free up a workload on-prem, you can move it to Azure. You actually there's about a 6-month grace period for doing that migration where you can run them both on-prem and in Azure. But in general, you pick either or for standard or for SQL. There are also some minimums. So you can apply these licenses to your Azure VMs, also Azure Stack or your Azure Kubernetes. So for the Windows Server licenses, you're going to need at least 8 cores for each virtual machine in Azure. You have to match it if it's more, so 16 cores for a 16-core VM. But if you only have a really small 1 or 2 core, you still need to apply 8 to it. And the rules for SQL are a little bit different as well. So for SQL, it's a minimum of 4 cores for each virtual machine, but you can consolidate data center or databases onto the same VM. So it's based on the VM itself. Next slide, Sean. So the question that I get most often is, should I buy licenses to take with me into Azure if I don't have some available? So obviously it's a no-brainer. If you have an enterprise agreement, you've got one of those big Microsoft agreements you've locked in for a few years, you've already invested in your server licenses, you've got data center, easy, no-brainer, just turn on some AHub to match up with whatever license entitlements you have. If you're not sure, talk to me, I can help you. But should you buy more licenses to bring with you? That's always the question that we get. So this, what I'm showing here on this slide is an example that I worked through. Just, you can see there's a variety of server sizes, different core sizes. And what I took, this is based on Canadian Central, Canadian dollars. And so to buy more licenses, the way that I calculate whether or not it's worth it, and this is the next slide is SQL Server. This is just looking at Windows Server for a second here. So when you look at buying more licenses, there's 2 different models that will work for licenses for Azure. You can have a license and software assurance, or you can have a subscription-based model for Windows Server licenses. Now, if you're looking at adding more license and software assurance, it might not make a ton of sense. What I've looked at here is an 8-core pack of Windows Server standard licenses, which for an annual cost is about $355. So that's what I've used as my benchmark to try and decide, should we buy more licenses? So if you take a look at the bottom box, the bigger one, the monthly pay-as-you-go operating system costs for each VM type, there's quite a range. The monthly costs range on this from $700 down to $8. So obviously the answer is going to be different for the different VM types. A lot of those smaller B or A series VMs, the operating system license charges are pretty minimal. So you're looking at, for the full year, $100, $200. So in that case, it's really not worth it. But when you get into the bigger VMs, the D series, E, F, those kinds of virtual machines, the operating system charges for Windows Server licensing, even for a 4-core, you're looking at over $1,000 a month for a 2-core server, and anywhere for like those 8 cores are about $4,000 a month. So obviously, an upfront cost of $355 is a lot more attractive than $4,000. So given that, the expectation here for the servers that are going to be right for flipping over to AHub and buying more licenses are ones that are running 24/7. If you're turning them off at night, those OS charges are definitely based on the hour consumption. But also, are they going to be permanent in your environment? Are there any plans to change them? So those would be the 2 considerations that we would want to talk about when looking to buy more servers. So in this comparison, the estimated total annual costs of the pay-as-you-go, just Azure native OS charges are almost $28,000. Now, with the mix of pay-as-you-go on the smaller servers and buying licenses in Azure or through the CSP program to bring to Azure, that will reduce the costs to a final state for your annual cost just down to $3,000. So that's an 88% cost savings. That's huge. And a comparison that I reviewed with the customer just this morning, it was about 85% of a cost reduction from the OS charges, but on their overall Azure bill, it was going to bring them down 15% on their total Azure bill. So that's pretty impactful just for making a couple changes and toggling on AHub. The risk here that I will point out is that buying these licenses is an upfront cost, and it does lock you in for the full year. You don't tie these licenses to a specific server, so they can be utilized if you're resizing VMs. And in that kind of a model, it's basically just a pool of core-based licenses that you now own and can be used in Azure. But again, very impactful from a cost savings percentage here, 88% cost savings on your OS charges. Now, the next question, so this was Windows Server. The next part is SQL, but unfortunately, that cost comparison looks a little bit different. Do you want to go to the next slide, Sean? So the costs for Azure SQL licenses are pretty standardized from VM type to VM type, and those are based more on the cores. So if you're looking at a 1 to 4 core virtual machine in Azure, the costs of the licensing for an enterprise server, and this is just the licensing costs. So an enterprise server is going to run you a little over $18,000 to run 24/7 for a full year on a smaller VM. The standard costs are around $4,800. Now, to buy licenses on a subscription model to take with you, those are actually going to run you more. So that's not something that I would recommend. And you lose that flexibility when you buy those licenses as well. So you won't see any cost savings for turning the servers off or if you were to make changes. So it's just not a great model when we're talking about SQL Server. However, there's definitely some specialized agreements out there. So in a case of a server and cloud enrollment with some special pricing Microsoft has offered, this core-based licensing that I've quoted here is a retail cost. So your specific locked-in pricing with Microsoft might be different, and that might be worth another look. Let me know if you think that's the case, and we can definitely talk more about it. So the answer to that question, should I buy more licenses in Azure? Probably some Windows Server licenses, definitely not SQL, based on the retail pricing. All right, we can move on to the next slide. So AHub is how you save money on the operating system component of the charges for your VMs. The other component for the charges is the compute side of things. And so there's a couple of different programs to utilize that Microsoft offers for cost savings around the compute side. So the newest one, and Microsoft just announced and introduced this in October of 2022, so just over a year ago, and they're called Azure Savings Plans. And to be honest, they're a little bit confusing. I've gotten a ton of questions and they seem to be a little bit hard to wrap your head around. So I'll give it a try and see if we can clarify that just a little bit. So I'm sure everyone is a lot more familiar with reserved instances over savings plans. Reserved instances is where you commit to a specific type of VM in a specific region and you get those cost savings because you've committed to that VM type for a period of 1 or 3 years. Savings plans are similar in that you are committing to a 1 or a 3-year term, but instead of committing to something specific or a specific SKU for a reserved instance, you're committing to an hourly compute spend in general. And so you can create a savings plan and it will be a lot more flexible. It's not going to be limited by your region and it's not going to be limited to a specific type of Azure VM. So you can resize your VMs, no problem, and the savings plan would still work for that. So what is the use case here? The two things to point out, because you're not tying it to a specific VM, if your environment is dynamic and you make changes regularly, if you're cyclical in your industry and things change rapidly, your requirements are changing based on seasons, that would be a great use case for savings plans over reserved instances. Also, if you turn things off at night, but you are spread out across the world in different data centers, so you could capture some hours of compute in North America during our business hours and in another region during other business hours, that's a great use case for savings plans. Also, another use case, if you're fairly new to Azure, if it's a new workload, if you're just not sure if you have the right VM sizes, start with a savings plan, run it for the first year, and then once your environment is a little more stable, you know a bit more about it, then maybe flip to reserved instances. That would be my recommendation for how to approach savings plans and where those would come into play. One interesting thing to note, savings plans are available for A-series virtual machines, reserved instances aren't. So if you have a whole bunch of those A-series, let's look at a savings plan. Savings plans can also be spun up, not just for virtual machines, but app services, Azure functions on the premium plans, container instances, and dedicated hosts. So there could potentially be opportunities to include more workloads into a savings plan to get some savings there. All right, next slide, Sean. So a couple of questions about savings plans. So when would I use it over reserved instance? I just covered that. So dynamic environments, spread out globally, things like that. How do I know how much to commit to? So Azure Advisor actually does a pretty good job of giving you some of that information. So there is some native tools in Azure that will tell you. Our team can also help with that. So if you're interested in savings plans, we can talk more about that. They are different from reserved instances in how they are managed a little bit. And what I mean by that is you cannot exchange savings plans because there's really no reason to. That's the model that they have is flexible to avoid things like having to do exchanges, but they also do not allow for cancellations. So if you were to commit to a 3-year savings plan, you are on the hook for the full 3 years. And then how much can I expect to save? Well, I'm glad I asked myself that because these are really just me asking myself questions here. So flip to the next slide and I have a comparison. All right, so this is based on a couple comparisons I've done recently. And as you can see, they're a mix of VMs. There's two comparisons here to quickly look at, but a 1-year savings plan and a 1-year reserved instance are going to get you the lowest amount of savings here. Obviously, if you commit to it for longer, Microsoft is going to give you a better price. So it looks like for the 1-year savings plans, 30% is probably what I would expect to see. The second comparison that I did, I was actually surprised. This customer has a pretty big mix of a lot of big VMs and a lot of really small ones, and the savings plan just didn't shake out as cost effective as the reserved instances did. So again, use the reserved instances where you can, where it makes sense, because that's a much better plan. In a stable environment where you can comfortably commit to 3 years of reserved instances, definitely recommend that because you're going to get up to almost 2/3 of that compute as a savings. Pretty impactful for your environment. And again, these numbers were just on the compute side only. So if we're going to blend savings on the compute plus savings on AHub, it's going to look even better than just that 2/3 savings. All right, next slide. All right, so in coordination with introducing savings plans, what Microsoft also did was they made some changes to the reserved instances. So the changes were announced and the, the start date is actually a little confusing. So what Microsoft did was they announced these changes would be effective January 1st, and then they came back with some more details and said, okay, there's actually a grace period, and the grace period starts January 1st. So these changes aren't going to be impactful until July 1st. So what Microsoft is changing with these reserved instances and how they're being managed is after July 1st of 2024, you will no longer be allowed to do exchanges on reserved instances that were created after that date. If you have some older reserved instances that are still in use that have been created before July 1st, then you are allowed one more exchange on those. And exchanges on reserved instances basically work like you're doing a cancellation and a new purchase. So it's unfortunate that that allowance is going away to be able to do those exchanges. However, there are still cancellations that can be done. So there are currently no fees for canceling a reservation. The only limitation is that you only can get a credit for up to 50,000 US dollars in a 12-month rolling period. It's a little different than a calendar period, so you just have to keep an eye on when you've done any cancellations. The allowance that they are bringing in for reservations instead of these exchanges for a different reserved instance, Microsoft will be encouraging customers to flip RIs into savings plans. So if you really need to resize those VMs and you can't do any more exchanges, if it's a brand new reserved instance, then the go forward model will be to flip that into a savings plan, run out the savings plan, and then maybe look at reserved instances again. All right, and then there's just a couple other things to note about reserved instances. So my next slide, if you want to go forward, Sean, is just a couple of important notes. So reserved instances, you can set them to auto renew and you will get a notification from Microsoft 30 days prior. They won't publish any prices of that reserved instance any sooner than 30 days before your expiry. So then they'll send you that email letting you know that it is set to auto renew and what your future pricing will be. Now, I just said there were no penalties for canceling reservations. There used to be. Before the pandemic, there was a 12% charge for canceling those reservations. But as the world went into lockdown and people were scrambling to try and make work from home work, Microsoft took that fee out so that customers could be a lot more dynamic in their environments and really just get their users set up to work from home successfully. So that 12% fee was removed. The Microsoft documentation actually says that they could bring it back at any time. So I do expect to see that 12% fee coming back. I just don't know when. And then there's more than just virtual machines that you can create reservations for. Some are on a capacity base, some are on a compute, but you can do it for your files and your blob storage and data factory and all sorts of SQL options there. Synapse, Databricks, App Service. So there's lots of options. The Azure Advisor, I'm sure if you have that set up to give you recommendations, it's pretty good about letting you know what workloads you have that could qualify for a reserved instance. All right, so that was it for the majority of the content, but what are some next steps? What should you be doing now? I'm sure this all sounds very interesting, but what does it actually mean for your environment? So next steps. Those little comparisons that I've been doing for customers, I'll do one for you, no charge. All you have to do is send me your virtual machine information. So there's a little bit of value for you just for joining this webinar. I will review your VMs. I will give you all of those AHUB and reserved instance recommendations for you. And then hopefully we'll see some pretty big savings in your environment. If you have questions or concerns about these changes to the reserved instance program and how they're actually going to impact your specific environment, reach out, set up a call. We can go through how to get in front of some of those changes if you're really concerned about it. I could help you calculate how much cancellations would cost in your environment to see what your limit is, some things like that. I'm happy to work through any of these questions to try and make you feel more comfortable with how your environment is set up for reserved instances and AHUB. Also, our team does a great job with some very thorough Azure cost optimization engagements that will look at your specific environment, do a deep dive into all your resources, and give you some very specific recommendations on maybe resizing some VMs or something like that. So if that's of interest, reach out and we're happy to put a proposal in front of you. Oh, that was a hard word to say at the end of talking. All right. Anything you want to add to that, Sean?
Steph, thanks so much, and to our guests that have joined here, thank you so much for investing some time with us. Steph, thanks. Your passion for the topic is so evident, and as an Invero leader, I'm so grateful that Steph has joined us, because what it's helped us do is taken this this set of capabilities we've built around technical architecture and deliver and design around Azure. And as I was saying at the top of the call, and really added that other leg of the stool around the licensing strategy and licensing advisory, because both are so important here. So I hope to all of you, you've got a sense of that this is not an element to be overlooked. Matter of fact, like Steph touched on, that Invero has capability to do that broader optimization that can cover both the well-architected framework as well as the license component. I'll tell you, in every one of those we've done, the higher percentage of savings is actually found in the licensing and everything that Steph just talked about. But the other part is every bit as important. So it's for Invero, we're really grateful that Steph's here to bolster up that licensing operation rigor, which really helps all of you as our clients. So as Steph said, look, like, take her up on the offer. For those of you that purchase licensing from us, thank you for your business. And just to reinforce the message, this is just part of our relationship, like just the ongoing proactive value engagement with Steph, being that wing person for you around your licensing. If you're not doing that with us, that's okay too. Like, well, hey, we're grateful that you joined here today, and we'd be more than happy to do that service for you and just do that look. Yeah, that's really what I wanted to add to it. And thank you all. We'll open it up to the audience if you have any questions here for Steph.